So please share your thoughts on the relevance of reason and spirituality in the life and context of Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa and Swami Vivekananda.
Sure, that's a good question. So, regarding Sri Ramakrishna, there are a few things, there are many things to say. It's a big question, but I'll just mention a few things. First, during his sadhana period, when he was engaged in intense spiritual practice, he was worshipping Mother Kali in the form of an image in Dakshineshwar, as most of us know, in the Kali temple, and weeping for Mother, and she was not revealing herself to him. And in despair, he asked her, he said, "Oh, Mother, are you just made of clay? Are you just a mere clay image, or are you a living reality? Show me." That's the use of reason. You see, at that point, even though he was such a great spiritual aspirant, he's still raising these doubts and asking these rational questions about whether Divine Mother is actually even real, or whether she's just a figment of people's imaginations. And then it got to a point later when he reached for a sword from the altar to cut his own throat because Mother's not revealing herself to him. And it's at that moment, just before he takes the sword to his throat, that she gives him this extraordinary vision. And he described it very beautifully as waves of consciousness engulfed him. And he lost external consciousness. And then when he recovered his consciousness, he just kept saying, "Ma, Ma." And so that's one example from Sri Ramakrishna's life of the use of reason in his spiritual practice. You see, there's always this intersection of reason and spirituality. And Swami Vivekananda, there are a number of incidents I can mention. One of them is before he met Sri Ramakrishna, he was very spiritually hungry. He was a spiritual seeker. And he went from one great teacher, spiritual teacher, to another, asking them, "Have you seen God? Have you seen God?" And nobody gave a direct answer, a direct yes, until he came to Sri Ramakrishna. And he asked Sri Ramakrishna the same question: "Have you seen God?" He said, "Yes, I've seen God, and I see her and talk to her as if she's more real than even you are." You see, again, very rational kind of question. Even after Swami Vivekananda started visiting Sri Ramakrishna on a regular basis, he started doubting his visions of Mother Kali and some of his claims. He claimed that he couldn't even touch metal because coins are made of metal, and he had completely renounced lust and greed and gold. So Swami Vivekananda was skeptical. So when Sri Ramakrishna was not in the room, he hid some coins under Sri Ramakrishna's mattress without telling him. And then Sri Ramakrishna walked back into the room, and Naren, the young Swami Vivekananda, he's watching very carefully. The moment he sat on the mattress, he shot up as if he was bitten by a scorpion. So there are many, many incidents like this where all these things are meant to show that reason and spirituality are actually complementary, not conflicting, that they can go and they should go hand in hand. And that through the use of reason, we can actually strengthen our faith, our religious and spiritual faith, and our commitment to spiritual practice.
Just adding to this question, Swamiji, many a times we see that the religious leaders, I'm not generalizing, but few of them, in all religions, they try to avoid this question of reason. And we have this, our Metropolitan, Paulos Mar Gregorios, who tried to explain spirituality, okay, to an extent, with reason also. Because that is also an intrinsic part of a human life, reason, using reason and applying it. So, Swamiji, according to you, what exactly should the religious leaders, how should they deal with this, the questions about reason when the young generation asks to them? Maybe they may not have faced in their initial times, these leaders, but now the question is coming, as you said, as Naren asked, that have you seen God? So now the students ask, who is God? Is there any God? So questions like that, even though they may be a very peripheral questions, but what is your suggestion regarding this?
Yeah, the thing is, I don't think they're peripheral questions at all. And in fact, I think that it's an integral part of every sincere spiritual aspirant's faith. Even in Christian theology, there's a concept of faith seeking understanding, right? The same idea. I have faith in God. And yet, when a loved one passes away tragically, when something terrible happens, what happens? Instinctively, I wonder, why did God allow this to happen? That's a deep philosophical question. It can sometimes result in a loss of faith, in fact. This happens. This is very common. So religious leaders need to be prepared for these kinds of questions, not only from skeptics, not only from agnostics and atheists, but also from their own congregation. And maybe they themselves will have these doubts. Who are they? They're not above that kind of questioning also. When things are going well, then everything is fine. But the moment something goes bad, then again, you yourself may doubt certain things. Until we have God realization, everybody will have doubts. In fact, the Vedantic scriptures, Bhagavad Gita, Upanishads, they say doubts do not completely disappear until you have attained the highest spiritual realization. Before then, there will always be some doubts. And to respond to those doubts, to be able to handle those doubts, you need to use reason. That's my feeling. The other thing is, religious leaders have to acknowledge the fact that this is a globalized world now. We're not living in these, independent countries because of the internet, because of the ubiquity of cell phones and all these other things. There's so many reasons why everybody's interconnected, which means what? India has become very westernized. The West has become influenced by Eastern ideas. That's why there's so yoga, mindfulness, all these things are so popular in the West. And in India, it's become very westernized in many ways. And all right, so it's really a global landscape now. In that context, obviously the young generation, this next generation of youth, will be asking very, very challenging questions that religious and spiritual leaders have not faced in previous generations. So spiritual leaders have a duty to prepare themselves and train themselves to be able to answer those kinds of questions instead of ignoring them or saying, oh, don't ask these questions, just believe. You should yourself do homework. All of these leaders should be doing that homework on their own to prepare themselves to be able to answer those questions. Yes.
What are a few ecological understandings in the writings of Swami Vivekananda and Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa?
Right. So this is another very big question. It's a good question, but very big question. I'll mention just a few things. So first of all, both Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, they were Vedantins, and they believed in karma and rebirth, these two very fundamental doctrines, okay? Now, how does this relate to this question of ecology, ecological consciousness? The idea is that one aspect of this doctrine of karma and rebirth is that human beings have souls, jivatmas, okay? And because depending on what our karma is, depending on what we do, how we behave in this life, it will determine our next birth. And when we leave this physical body, what happens? The soul, the jivatma, will leave this physical body. It may dwell in some other loka, another realm for some time, and then it'll come back to this world in a different physical body. Now, what the doctrines of karma and rebirth say is that it's not just human beings that have souls. And here there are some differences with Christianity, many differences, because Orthodox Christianity does not accept karma and rebirth. But I'm explaining the Vedantic approach, right? What they say is that even non-human animals have souls. Even plants have souls. You see, so what are the ecological implications? Very, very profound. If we know that even dogs, even cats, even hamsters, even ants are embodied souls, won't that change our attitude toward them? Won't that change the way that we behave with these things? Even if once we learn that even plants and trees and crops themselves have souls, maybe we'll think about our attitude toward this ecological landscape in a very different way. So that's one aspect of it. Now, another aspect of their ecological understanding has to do with a very special spiritual experience, which Ramakrishna spoke about, and which Swami Vivekananda also talked about very frequently. Sri Ramakrishna referred to it as the spiritual state of Vijnana. Vijnana means a very intimate knowledge of the divine. And Sri Ramakrishna says that the Vijnani, the person who has attained the state of Vijnana, sees that Divine Mother has become everything in this world, both sentient and insentient, absolutely everything, from tables to chairs to cows to dogs to monkeys to human beings. There's nothing but God. If there's nothing but God, if everything is divine, shouldn't we treat this world and serve this world as divine? Isn't the highest worship to serve this world in a loving, with a loving attitude? So then that'll change the way we think about our attitude toward the environment, toward plants, toward trees, toward non-human animals, toward other human beings. It'll completely revolutionize our spiritual attitude, actually. Mm-hmm.
Swamiji, what according to you were the views of Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa and Swami Vivekananda about monasticism and its relevance?
Yeah. So Sri Ramakrishna used to say that monks are Jagat Gurus, which means they're teachers of the whole world, spiritual teachers of the whole world, which means they have to live up to very, very high standards, very, very high standards. They have to set an example for everyone else. These are very high standards, very difficult to follow, but he taught these ideals. And he said, monks have to completely renounce lust and greed. These are the two fundamental vows of a monk. And another very important practice, which is not just for monks, but for all spiritual aspirants, is recommended by Sri Ramakrishna, Shiva Jnane Jiva Seva, which means instead of looking at other people with the eyes of pity, feeling pity for other people who are in suffering, he says that feeling of pity implies a certain position of superiority. I'm looking down at that person and thinking, oh, what a poor soul. That means I'm in a much better position, obviously, right? He's saying, no, who are we to feel pity for others? What we should do is serve others in a spirit of worship by trying to see the divine in everyone. Shiva Jnane Jiva Seva. And what Swami Vivekananda did when he founded this monastic order, the Ramakrishna order, which I belong to, which I'm very proud to belong to, is he incorporated Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on Shiva Jnane Jiva Seva, this idea of serving others in a spirit of worship. He built it into the slogan, the overarching motto of our monastic order. And he coined a Sanskrit phrase to capture that. That Sanskrit phrase is Atmano Mokshartham Jagad Hitaya Cha. Okay, which means for one's own spiritual enlightenment, for one's own liberation, and for the welfare of humanity. And these twin ideals have to go hand in hand. You cannot just seek your own liberation and ignore humanity. That would be selfish. It would be a kind of higher spiritual form of selfishness. And in fact, Sri Ramakrishna used to say, some very spiritually advanced souls, they are still selfish because they only care about their own salvation, their own liberation. And he said, other great souls are like these huge logs, these huge pieces of timber, which can float across a river very easily and also carry many other creatures on it, along with it, you see. So the truly spiritual person should also be humanity-minded. They should be thinking about others and trying to serve others to the best of their ability. So that's a kind of new approach to monasticism within an Indian Vedantic context, because it wasn't so emphasized in earlier Vedantic monasticism. But Swami Vivekananda introduced that idea, inspired by his master Sri Ramakrishna, this idea of serving humanity in a spirit of worship. That's very fundamental.
Swamiji, this is a very general question, but also a question that has to be thought about and very much in discussion. Why do righteous people suffer in this world?
Yes, this is a huge $1 million question. It's called the problem of evil or the problem of suffering. It's a well-known problem in philosophy of religion, in theology. It's occupied some of the best minds for millennia. And different religious traditions give very different answers to this question, depending on its background assumptions. So I've done quite a bit of academic work on the problem of evil from the standpoint of our spiritual tradition, the tradition of Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. So I'm going to summarize Sri Ramakrishna's answer to this question. At the same time, if you want more details, more depth, more evidence and rigor, please look at chapters 7 and 8 of my book, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2018, called Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion. So why do righteous people suffer? Or even, let's broaden the question a little bit. Why is there so much suffering in the world? Okay, and of course, to answer that question, we'll also address this issue of why do righteous people suffer. So what does Sri Ramakrishna say? His response to this question has 3 different dimensions. The first dimension is what philosophers call skeptical theism. Okay. One time, a devotee, he mentioned to Sri Ramakrishna that Genghis Khan, many people are familiar with Genghis Khan, this historical figure, he ordered the killing of about 100,000 prisoners. Okay. And this devotee tells Sri Ramakrishna that this seems very strange, that God witnessed this killing, this slaughter, this mass slaughter of 100,000 people. We can think of more modern examples, the Nazi Holocaust, many things that are happening almost on a daily basis now in Gaza, Bangladesh, and so many places. Really terrible things, right? God saw it. Now, God is by definition omnipotent, which means all-powerful. He can prevent this kind of suffering from happening if he wanted to. God is also omniscient, which means he knows everything that's going on. He cannot be ignorant of any kind of suffering that's going on in this world. And God is perfectly loving. He loves us perfectly. He's perfectly good, unlike us who are imperfect creatures. But if God loves us perfectly, why does he allow us to suffer? Wouldn't a loving parent try to prevent her children from suffering? This is the logic. This is the intuition. Sri Ramakrishna answers as follows. He says, is it possible to understand God's ways? Is it possible to understand why God creates, why she sometimes preserves, why at other times she also destroys, why sometimes she chooses to let people suffer and even to die sometimes? This, in a nutshell, is what philosophers call skeptical theism. The idea is, just because I cannot understand why God permits a particular instance of suffering, it could be my own suffering, it could be the suffering of a loved one, it could be suffering that I see in the news in some other country. Just because I can't understand why God permits that suffering, I should never jump to the conclusion that God didn't have a good reason for permitting that suffering. And why? Why should I not jump to that conclusion? The reason being that there's an infinite gulf between the omniscient mind of God and the puny intellect that human beings have. Who am I to judge? How can I judge? How can I possibly know that God should not have permitted the suffering? That requires knowledge that I simply don't have, that I can never have. That's the idea. It's like when I'm watching a chess match between 2 great grandmasters of chess, Magnus Carlsen, Pragyananda, something, these. And Magnus Carlsen, the world's greatest chess player, he decides to sacrifice his queen, the most important, most powerful piece in the game. He sacrifices the queen. Now, I can have one of 2 responses. One response is, this guy must be an idiot. Why did he do that? He made a big mistake. It might look like that to me because I wouldn't have done that, but I'm not a very good chess player. I'm just an amateur. I know the rules, but I'm extremely mediocre at chess. Whereas this guy is the best chess player in the world. So one response is he's an idiot. Second response is, wow, that's a very surprising move. I don't know why he sacrificed his queen, but he must have some good reason for sacrificing his queen, even though I cannot even begin to understand what that reason might be. That second kind of response is skeptical theism. That is the more reasonable response to have in the face of the suffering that we encounter on a regular basis. Okay, that's the first of three dimensions in Sri Ramakrishna's response to the problem of evil and suffering. Now, the second dimension also requires quite a bit of explanation. This is what I call Sri Ramakrishna's saint-making theodicy. Okay? Theodicy, first of all, this is a term that's very common now, but which some people may not be familiar with, so I'm going to explain it. Theodicy is a term coined by Leibniz, the Western philosopher Leibniz, and it's comprised of two words, theos, which means God, and dice means justice. So it's defending the justice of God in the face of suffering, explaining why God permits all this suffering in the world. Okay? Now, I call Sri Ramakrishna's theodicy a saint-making theodicy because in one place, this is recorded in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, one of the famous books in our tradition. Somebody asks him, why does God make us suffer? And his answer is, in order to create saints. In order to create saints. It's a very interesting answer. And he says, one becomes a saint by conquering the senses, by exercising self-control, by controlling and by finally eliminating our lower impulses and instincts, lust and greed and anger and so forth. And he says, but what is the connection with suffering and all that? The idea is, it's through the experience of our own suffering and through our own experiences, both good and bad, and I can do something very good and I'll reap the consequences and I'll see, oh, that's a very good thing. I should do that again. I also, every one of us has committed sins and we've done bad things toward ourselves, toward other people. And we also reap the consequences of those actions. And we suffer as a result. And we learn through that suffering. You know, Swami Vivekananda used to say, the secret of life is not enjoyment, but education through experience. We can learn so much through our experiences not just of happiness, not just of good, nice things, pleasant things, but equally, if not more, from our experiences, very negative experiences. It can be experiences of suffering, of great pain, sorrow, despair, depression. Each one of us, I can guarantee you, has learned something from our negative experiences. We might learn more, actually, from our experiences of suffering. Now, also, we learn from looking at how other people suffer in this world, looking at how even some of what seem to be the most quote-unquote successful people, very beautiful actresses and actors and billionaires and this and that, even they suffer. And we watch and we wonder, if they suffer, then where does that leave us? You say, oh, and why are they suffering? Because even if you have $1 billion, that billionaire wants $10 billion. The person with one yacht wants 5 yachts, which means desire is never satisfied. Now I know why even Elon Musk is suffering, why even Bill Gates is suffering. But do you see what I mean? So we can learn through all these experiences slowly by experiencing suffering in ourselves, by encountering suffering and evil outside us. We gradually learn to exercise self-control and overcome our lower animal instincts, our selfish impulses, and become more and more ethical and more spiritual, ultimately leading to God realization. That's the idea. That's it, very briefly, the second dimension, but it also has 3 more key doctrines, okay? The 2 doctrines I've already mentioned, karma and rebirth, and the third doctrine is universal liberation, okay? What Sri Ramakrishna says is, this spiritual journey is a journey of many lifetimes. It's no joke. And it's not easy. And it's almost impossible for somebody to reach the end of the spiritual journey in one lifetime. So we have to believe in karma and rebirth. If we believe in karma and rebirth, what happens? Imagine I'm a spiritual aspirant in this life. I work hard to be a good person, but I also fail sometimes. And I engage in spiritual practices somewhat sincerely, but even then, I could be more sincere. What happens? At the end of my life, I haven't attained God realization. I have not attained liberation, which means I have to come back again. When I come back again in a different body, that's the same soul will come back in a different physical body. You don't start from scratch. You start from where you left off in your previous life. So it's like a bank account, a savings account. Whatever I did in my previous life will carry over into my next life, and I'll start from there. If I had $100,000 in my bank balance from the previous life, I'll start with $100,000. Then maybe in the next life I'll make $1 million. This is a metaphor, obviously. It means karma. Spiritual credit, you can think about it that way. Whatever spiritual efforts I've made, ethical efforts I've made, they won't be wasted. They'll carry over into the next life. So why is that important? The idea is that we shouldn't freak out by thinking that it's all or nothing and I have to achieve liberation in this life, otherwise my whole life is a failure. It's good to have this sense of urgency in spiritual life, but at the same time, we should also be realistic. And we should recognize that spiritual life and our spiritual journey is a journey of many, many lifetimes. We have lived many times in the past. We will be reborn again, so long as we have not attained the highest spiritual goal of life. But each one of us can rest assured that every single soul will eventually be liberated. It'll attain the highest goal, the highest spiritual enlightenment, realization, every single one. There's no such thing as an eternal hell in our tradition, okay? This is also very important for answering this question, because even according to a number of Christian theologians, I'll mention one named John Hick, okay? What they say is, if Christianity assumes the existence of an eternal hell, it cannot answer this problem of evil in a satisfactory way. Because if God is perfectly loving, God must want to save every single soul. Why would God condemn even a single soul to eternal damnation? There may be temporary hells. In Vedanta also there are temporary hells, but it cannot be eternal. If it's eternal, either God is not omnipotent, which means God cannot save us even though he wants to, or God is not perfectly loving. But we cannot accept both that God is omnipotent and that God is perfectly loving if we accept an eternal hell. So in our tradition, we reject the idea of an eternal hell. In fact, every single person is guaranteed liberation. Most people will not get liberation in this lifetime. But eventually, everybody will get liberation. The way that Sri Ramakrishna would put it is, some people are fed at 6 in the morning, other people at noon, other people at 6 p.m., other people at midnight. But nobody will be left unfed. That's the idea. And the third dimension in Sri Ramakrishna's response to the problem of evil and suffering is what I would call the panentheistic standpoint of Vijnana. I already mentioned this Vijnana, this realization that there's nothing but God in this world. Why is this relevant to this question of evil and suffering? See, the idea is the problem of evil, the problem of suffering, okay, presupposes a certain kind of dualism. Because on the one hand, there is God, and on the other hand are God's poor, suffering creatures, us, poor us, the people who are suffering. And those people are asking, oh God, why are you allowing us to suffer? Why do you make us suffer? This is the question. Now, what this third dimension of Sri Ramakrishna's response to the problem of evil does is, instead of solving the problem of evil, it dissolves the problem of evil. Did you catch that? D-I-S-S-O-L-V-E-S. Instead of a solution to the problem of evil, it dissolves, it provides a dissolution of the problem of evil, because it rejects the very premise of the problem of suffering, which is that God is different from his suffering creatures. In fact, each one of us is nothing but a manifestation of the same God. God is playfully manifesting as you. God is playfully manifesting as me. And if we have that highest spiritual realization, which Sri Ramakrishna would call vijnana, the problem of suffering won't even arise. How can it arise when we see nothing but God? In fact, there's a very beautiful incident in Sri Ramakrishna's life when he sees a butterfly struggling to fly, and it seems to be dying because it has a splinter lodged in its wing. And Sri Ramakrishna feels terrible anguish for this butterfly, for this poor butterfly, and thinks to himself, what poor boy, what cruel boy must have inflicted this pain on this butterfly out of some kind of sadistic joy. In the next moment, Sri Ramakrishna goes into a state of spiritual ecstasy and starts laughing and saying, and then he says, "Oh, mother, now I see that you yourself are playing in the form of the wounded butterfly. You yourself are the splinter lodged in the butterfly. You yourself are the cruel boy inflicting pain on that butterfly. And you yourself are me. You are also me. There's nothing but you, O mother. So what evil, what suffering? You see, so from the highest standpoint, the problem of evil cannot arise. The problem of suffering cannot arise because there's no difference anymore between God on the one hand and us on the other hand. Okay, so that's a brief summary. If you want more details, please look at chapter 7 and 8 of my book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Swamiji, for your very valuable time, especially for accepting the interview and giving us a very thought-provoking ideas, sharing with us, especially from the life of Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa and Swami Vivekananda.
Thank you so much, Father Shinu.
Yeah, thank you.
May God bless you, Jai Ma.
Thank you. Thank you.